It's 480 BC, and the largest war machine ever assembled in human history is marching straight toward a handful of warriors trapped in a narrow corridor carved between mountains and sea. These men aren't naive. They know exactly what's coming. Behind them stands everything that gives their lives meaning. Their loved ones, their independence, their civilization itself. In front of them, an unstoppable tide of enemy forces so vast that, when they fire their bows, the sheer volume of arrows literally blocks out the sunlight. These defenders have already accepted their fate. They know rescue isn't an option. Yet instead of running, they lock their shields together, plant themselves like trees, and prepare to author one of the most astonishing stories ever told in warfare. This is how 300 Spartan warriors, alongside their Greek brothers, stood defiant against mathematically impossible odds and fundamentally altered the trajectory of Western civilization forever. Before we transport you back to this jaw-dropping tale of sacrifice and unshakable resolve, do me a quick favor. Smash that subscribe button and activate notifications. You're not going to want to miss the incredible historical deep dives we have coming your way. Now, let's rewind 2,500 years and witness what happens when courage meets destiny. Thermopylae isn't some forgotten skirmish collecting dust in academic journals. This is a story that has reverberated across 25 centuries, continuously inspiring generation after generation with its unfiltered display of bravery against unimaginable opposition. But here's what most people don't realize. The true narrative goes infinitely deeper than any Hollywood blockbuster could capture. This wasn't simply about 300 soldiers choosing a heroic death. This was about two radically different civilizations colliding head-on. The expanding tsunami of Persian domination crashing against the uncompromising independence of Greek society. This was about a calculated strategic risk that would either rescue or completely annihilate the birthplace of democratic government. And fundamentally, this was about regular human beings who decided to do something absolutely remarkable when everything they cherished hung precariously in the balance. To genuinely comprehend what unfolded at those infamous gates squeezed between cliffs and coastline, we need to zoom out and examine the larger forces at play. We need to understand what brought these massive armies face to face, the leaders who commanded them, and precisely why this particular confrontation transcended typical warfare to become immortal legend. This goes beyond military history. It's the story of how a determined minority can literally bend the arc of human destiny itself. Our narrative actually begins not at Thermopylae, but on the battlefield of Marathon a full decade earlier, in 490 BC. King Darius of the Persian Empire had launched his first significant invasion of Greece, absolutely certain that his colossal empire would effortlessly steamroll these fractured city-states. Instead, he experienced one of military history's most spectacular upsets. A considerably smaller Athenian force, defending their homeland with desperate ferocity, completely demolished his forces. Persian warriors scattered in humiliating retreat toward their ships, abandoning equipment and dignity alike. For Darius, this wasn't merely a tactical setback. It was a stinging humiliation that rattled the very credibility of Persian imperial dominance. How could the mightiest empire the world had ever witnessed be embarrassed by what he considered a rabble of Greek merchants and farmers? Marathon's defeat became an all-consuming obsession that haunted Darius until his final breath. But when death claimed him, that burning hunger for vengeance transferred to his heir, a man whose ambitions would make his father's dreams look almost quaint in comparison. Xerxes wasn't interested in simple payback. Where Darius envisioned a punitive strike, Xerxes imagined total domination. He genuinely believed himself divinely chosen, a god walking among mortals whose manifest destiny was conquering the entire known world. Greece wasn't just going to be punished, it was going to be completely absorbed into his ever-expanding domain. For 4 relentless years, Xerxes assembled what ancient historians describe as the most enormous military concentration ever gathered. From every corner of his sprawling empire, stretching from the Indian subcontinent to Egyptian deserts, from Central Asian steppes to Black Sea shores. He summoned soldiers. Modern scholars debate exact figures, but even conservative calculation suggests a ground force numbering between 70,000 and 300,000 troops, supported by over 1,200 warships. The logistical nightmare of moving such an army was staggering, but Xerxes attacked these challenges with unlimited imperial resources. He commanded engineers to dig a canal through the Athos Peninsula, giving his fleet safer passage. Even more audaciously, he ordered construction of a ship bridge across the Hellespont Strait, essentially building a temporary bridge exceeding a mile in length that would allow his entire army to march from Asia directly into Europe. When storms destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes' response revealed everything about his psychology and character. He ordered the sea itself whipped 300 times as punishment, and had the engineers responsible for the failure executed. This wasn't rational military leadership responding to setbacks. This was divine rage from a man who truly believed nature itself should submit to his authority. The second bridge held, and in 480 BC, this incredible procession began flowing from Asia into Europe. Ancient accounts describe the crossing consuming 7 continuous days and nights, with soldiers, cavalry, supply wagons, and followers streaming across in an endless demonstration of imperial power. While Xerxes orchestrated his invasion machine, the Greeks confronted a horrifying reality. Most northern city-states, calculating the mathematics of resistance as hopeless, had already surrendered to Persian authority. The scattered Greek cities faced an existential choice that would define their future: surrender their freedom or unite in desperate collective defense. In this crisis moment, leadership naturally gravitated toward the one Greek state universally acknowledged as possessing supreme military capability: Sparta. But Sparta wasn't just another city-state with a competent army. It was something historically unique, a civilization that had transformed itself into a living weapon. Where other Greek cities pursued commerce, philosophy, artistic expression, and political debate, Sparta had laser-focused on one deadly craft: manufacturing the world's most devastatingly effective soldiers. Their entire social structure, known as the agoge, revolved around this singular purpose. It was a machine engineered specifically for creating warriors, unlike anything else in the ancient world. The Spartan way began before birth itself. When children entered the world, community elders would examine each infant, and any baby judged weak or imperfect would be abandoned on mountainsides to perish. This brutal culling ensured only the strongest survived to perpetuate Spartan bloodlines. For those who passed this first brutal test, life followed rigid regimentation from childhood. At age 7, boys were removed from family homes and entered the ago, a state-controlled training program that would dominate the next decade of their existence. They learned basic reading and writing, but the real curriculum centered on survival, physical conditioning, and military technique. They lived in communal barracks and were intentionally kept hungry to teach resourcefulness. They were expected to steal food, but if caught, punishment was severe, not for the theft itself, but for being incompetent enough to get discovered. The training systematically stripped away individual weakness and forged men who would execute orders without hesitation and endure any suffering without complaint. They learned to function as components of a larger unit, to trust fellow soldiers completely, and to view battlefield death as preferable to retreat or surrender. Spartan society reinforced these military values at every level. Courage wasn't just admired, it was the supreme virtue. Cowardice wasn't just discouraged, it was met with absolute social exile. A Spartan who fled combat would be shunned by family, friends, and community alike. The shame was genuinely considered worse than death. Even Spartan women played crucial roles in this warrior culture. Unlike women in other Greek societies, Spartan women received education and physical training. Their primary responsibility was understood to be raising strong sons for the state. The famous Spartan saying has mothers instructing their sons to return from battle with your shield or on it, meaning come home victorious or come home dead, because fleeing soldiers would abandon their heavy shields. This was the system that produced King Leonidas and his 300 royal bodyguards. men shaped by this harsh crucible, who embodied everything Spartan society valued most. As Xerxes' colossal army pushed southward through Greece, the Greek alliance confronted a seemingly unsolvable strategic puzzle. How do you halt a force that outnumbers you by factors of 10 or even 100? The answer emerged from Themistocles, the brilliant Athenian strategist who had orchestrated the Marathon victory. Themistocles proposed a coordinated land-sea operation that would exploit geography to neutralize Persian numerical supremacy. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Force the Persians to attack through a constricted pass where their overwhelming numbers became irrelevant, while simultaneously blocking their navy in narrow straits where it couldn't effectively maneuver. The location selected for the ground battle was a narrow coastal passage in central Greece called Thermopylae, literally translated as the hot gates in Greek, named for sulfur springs bubbling up from the earth. In 480 BC, this pass was extraordinarily constricted, squeezed between steep mountain walls on one side and the sea on the other. At its narrowest point, it measured perhaps only 100 meters wide, barely sufficient space for a few dozen men standing shoulder to shoulder. The strategic brilliance of this selection cannot be overstated. The narrow confines of Thermopylae would function as a force multiplier for the Greeks, completely negating Persian numerical advantage. Regardless of how many soldiers Xerxes commanded, he could only funnel a limited number through the pass at any moment. The Greeks, fighting in their traditional phalanx formation, would meet Persian attacks on essentially equal numerical terms. Moreover, their position would force Persians into precisely the type of engagement where Greek advantages in training, equipment, and tactical discipline would shine brightest. The Persians would have to assault uphill through a narrow gap against a prepared defensive position held by the world's most elite infantry. But a problem threatened to derail the entire strategy. The Persian invasion coincided with two of the most sacred periods in Greek religious observance, the Olympic Games and Sparta's own Carnia festival. Spartan law absolutely prohibited military operations during Carnia. It was considered a sacred obligation, superseding even existential threats to the state. Faced with this impossible choice between religious duty and national survival, the Spartan council crafted a compromise revealing both their legalistic mindset and their desperation. They couldn't dispatch the full army, but they would authorize King Leonidas to march north immediately with his personal bodyguard of 300 men. These weren't randomly selected soldiers. They were the elite of the elite, veteran warriors handpicked by Leonidas himself from among the royal guard. Herodotus adds a chilling detail suggesting everyone understood the probable outcome. Leonidas specifically selected men who already had sons, ensuring family bloodlines would continue even if the warriors didn't return. The story is about to take an incredible turn, but before we continue, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Leonidas' position? Would you have withdrawn to preserve your forces, or made the same choice he did? Drop your perspective in the comments below, and don't forget to smash that like button if you're captivated by this deep dive into one of history's most legendary confrontations. Before departing Sparta, Leonidas made a pilgrimage that would become woven into legend itself. He traveled to Delphi to consult the oracle, the most venerated spiritual authority throughout Greece. The prophecy he received was both terrifying and cryptic, delivered in the ambiguous style that made the oracle renowned across the ancient world. The oracle spoke of two divergent futures. Either Sparta itself would be annihilated by invaders, or a Spartan king of royal lineage would need to perish to preserve the city. For a man raised in Spartan culture, where duty to the state eclipsed all personal considerations, this wasn't really a dilemma at all. Leonidas understood his death might be the purchase price of his people's survival, and he accepted that burden without a moment's hesitation. As Leonidas marched northward, he gathered additional allies en route. By the time the Greek force reached Thermopylae, it totaled around 7,000 men, Still a microscopic army by ancient standards, but respectable for what was essentially a delaying action. The force included Spartans, Thespians, Thebans, and soldiers from several other Greek cities. Upon reaching the pass, the Greeks immediately began fortifying their defensive position. They rebuilt and reinforced an ancient barrier known as the Phocian Wall, which blocked the narrowest section of the pass. Behind this wall, they positioned their forces in the formation that had made Greek infantry feared throughout the Mediterranean world. To understand what happened next, you need to grasp the Greek phalanx formation and why it was so devastatingly effective. A Greek hoplite warrior was essentially a mobile fortress. He wore bronze armor covering chest and legs, topped by the distinctive Corinthian helmet encasing his entire head. His primary weapon was a long spear called a doru, and for close quarters fighting he carried a short sword. But the most critical piece of equipment was the hoplite, a large circular shield constructed of wood and bronze that protected him from neck to knee. When hoplites formed up for battle, they stood shoulder to shoulder, overlapping shields to create what was essentially a mobile bronze wall. Front ranks pointed their long spears forward, creating a deadly forest of spear points that could halt any charge. In Thermopylae's narrow confines, this formation would be nearly impregnable. The Persians would be compelled to attack frontally against prepared positions, and their superior numbers would be meaningless in the restricted space. When the Persian army finally arrived at Thermopylae, it must have been an absolutely terrifying spectacle. Ancient accounts describe a force so immense it appeared to stretch to the horizon, with banners and weaponry glittering under the sun. Xerxes established his command position on a nearby hillside where he could observe the battle unfold, confident that merely the sight of his army would send the Greeks fleeing in panic. For 4 days, nothing happened. Xerxes waited, genuinely unable to believe this tiny force would actually dare resist him. He dispatched messengers demanding surrender and, according to ancient sources, received some of the most famous responses in military history. When informed that Persians possessed so many archers their arrows would blot out the sun, a Spartan warrior supposedly replied, "Excellent, then we'll fight in the shade." The Greeks used this time for final preparations. They exercised, maintained equipment, and performed traditional pre-battle rituals. Spartan warriors combed their long hair, a custom they followed before battles they expected might be their last. Finally, Xerxes' patience shattered. On the 5th day, he ordered the attack to commence. The battle opened not with a charge but with a massive arrow barrage. Persian archers were among the world's finest, and when thousands fired simultaneously, the effect was exactly as Greeks had been warned. The sky darkened with projectiles. But the Greeks were prepared. They simply raised their heavy bronze shields, creating an overlapping shell that deflected the arrow storm with contemptuous ease. When the barrage ended, the Greek line remained intact, waiting calmly for the real fight. Frustrated by his archers' failure, Xerxes sent in his first infantry wave, 10,000 Medes and Scythians, with orders to capture the Greeks alive and bring them before the king. What followed was a masterclass in military tactics and a demonstration of what superior training and equipment could accomplish against raw numbers. The Persian infantry charged forward with tremendous bravery, but they were doomed from the moment they entered the pass. Their weapons were designed for open Asian battlefields, shorter spears and lighter shields suitable for mobile warfare. Against the Greek phalanx, these weapons were completely inadequate. The Persians found themselves running into what was essentially a mechanical meat grinder. Their shorter spears couldn't reach the Greeks, while Greek spears easily found targets. Their wicker and leather shields shattered against Greek bronze, while Persian weapons couldn't penetrate Greek armor. As men in front ranks fell, they were trampled by ranks behind, creating chaos and panic. The Greeks, meanwhile, fought with mechanical precision. They had trained for years in these exact formations, and the pass's narrow confines played perfectly to their strengths. They fought in relays, with fresh warriors rotating to the front as others tired, maintaining constant pressure on increasingly demoralized enemies. By the first day's end, thousands of Persian soldiers lay dead in the pass, while Greek casualties were minimal. Xerxes had thrown a massive force at the Greek position and watched it shatter like waves against rocky cliffs. The devastating failure left Xerxes in a state of frustrated disbelief. This wasn't how warfare was supposed to function. In Xerxes' experience, when the Persian Empire wanted something, it took it through overwhelming force and superior numbers. The concept that a handful of Greeks could stand against his entire army was almost incomprehensible. But Xerxes had one more card to play: his personal elite guard, known throughout the ancient world as the Immortals. This was the cream of Persian military might, 10,000 professional warriors drawn from imperial nobility. They were called Immortals because whenever one fell in battle or became ill, he was immediately replaced, maintaining the illusion of an invincible, undying unit. These men were better equipped than regular Persian infantry, wearing scale armor and carrying superior weapons. They had fought in countless campaigns across Asia and had never encountered their match. Surely, Xerxes reasoned, where regular troops had failed, the Immortals would succeed. The Immortals attacked with disciplined fury, their reputation and honor on the line. But once again, the pass's narrow confines neutralized their advantages. No matter their individual skill, they still couldn't penetrate the Greek shield wall. It was during this second day that Greeks employed one of their most effective tactical innovations: the feigned retreat. The phalanx would appear to break and flee, tricking Persians into abandoning formation for disorganized pursuit. Then, on signal, Greeks would suddenly turn, reform their shield wall in seconds, and slaughter the surprised and overextended enemy. This tactic required incredible discipline and timing, precisely the qualities the phalanx system was designed to develop. The Persians, fighting as individuals rather than a cohesive unit, fell for it repeatedly. Ancient sources record that Xerxes leaped from his throne 3 times during the battle, watching in horror as even his most elite troops were cut to pieces. The pass had become a slaughterhouse filled with bodies of his finest soldiers, while the Greek line remained essentially unbroken. By the second day's end, Persian morale was beginning to crack. They had thrown everything at this tiny Greek force and had nothing to show but massive casualties. Word spread through the Persian camp that Greeks were supernatural, that they couldn't be defeated by mortal warriors. For 2 full days, approximately 7,000 Greeks had held off an army exceeding 100,000. Leonidas' strategy was working perfectly. Every hour the Greeks held the pass was another hour for the rest of Greece to prepare defenses. But unknown to the Greeks, their time was running out. As the Greeks rested after their second day of stunning success, a figure emerged from the shadows who would change everything. His name was Ephialtes, a local Greek who knew every path and trail winding through the mountains around Thermopylae. Driven by the seductive promise of Persian gold, he made his way to Xerxes' camp with intelligence that would seal the fate of the 300 Spartans. Ephialtes revealed the existence of a narrow mountain trail called the Thermopylae path. This ancient track wound through the mountains behind the Greek position, allowing a force to completely bypass the main pass and emerge behind Leonidas' army. For the right price, Ephialtes was willing to guide Persian soldiers along this hidden route. The irony was bitter. The Greeks weren't betrayed by a Persian spy or captured enemy soldier, but by one of their own countrymen, a man whose name would become synonymous with treachery for the next 2,500 years. Xerxes immediately grasped this intelligence's significance. He ordered his general Hydarnes to take the elite Immortals and follow Ephialtes along the mountain path under darkness. If they could position themselves behind the Greek forces by dawn, they could attack from both front and rear simultaneously, crushing the defenders in a devastating pincer movement. the Persian force began their treacherous night march. The path was narrow and dangerous, winding through steep mountain terrain that would challenge even in daylight. But the promise of finally breaking the stalemate drove them forward through the darkness. What Ephialtes and the Persians didn't know was that Leonidas had anticipated exactly this possibility. The Spartan king was too experienced a commander to leave flanks unguarded. He had stationed 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the mountain, specifically to watch the Thermopylae path and prevent exactly the flanking maneuver the Persians were now attempting. As dawn broke on the third day, the advancing Persians stumbled upon the Phocian guards. The defenders' first warning was rustling leaves as the enemy force moved through underbrush. After a brief arrow exchange, the Phocians made a catastrophic error in judgment. Assuming they were the primary target, the Phocian soldiers retreated up the mountain to make what they believed would be their last stand. But the Persians weren't interested in fighting them. They had a far more important objective: getting behind Leonidas and trapping the main Greek force in the pass below. The Persians simply ignored the Phocians and continued down the mountain path. By the time a messenger reached Leonidas with word of the disaster, it was too late. The Persian force was already positioning behind the Greek army. The trap was closing, and there was no escape route. When news reached Leonidas that Persian forces were moving to surround his position, he immediately convened a war council. The situation was desperate. With enemies approaching from both front and rear, the Greek army faced certain annihilation if they remained in the pass. Most allied commanders argued for immediate retreat. They had achieved their primary objective, holding the pass for 3 days and inflicting enormous casualties on the Persian army. Now the sensible thing was withdrawing, preserving the army, and continuing the fight elsewhere. Leonidas agreed for most of the force. He ordered the bulk of the Greek army to retreat immediately while the route remained open. This wasn't surrender or defeat, it was sound military strategy. The delaying action had served its purpose, and preserving these men for future battles was more important than a futile gesture. But Leonidas himself wasn't going anywhere. For a Spartan king, retreat was unthinkable. He was bound by the warrior code that had shaped his entire existence, by the oracle's prophecy, and by his own sense of duty. He and his 300 Spartans would remain in the pass, fighting to the end to cover their allies' escape. The Spartans weren't entirely alone in their final stand. In an act of incredible heroism that often gets overshadowed by Spartan legend, the entire contingent of 700 soldiers from the city of Thermopylae, led by their commander Thermopylae, voluntarily chose to stay and die with Leonidas. This wasn't expected of them. They could have retreated with honor intact, but they made the conscious choice to share the Spartans' fate, knowing full well what it meant. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered alongside that of the 300. The 400 Thebans also remained, though ancient sources suggest they may have been compelled to stay rather than volunteering, and some apparently surrendered during the final battle rather than fighting to the death. Knowing the end was near, Leonidas reportedly told his men to eat a hearty breakfast, because that evening they would dine in the underworld. It was a perfectly Spartan response to imminent death, practical, unflinching, and tinged with dark humor. When the final Persian assault began, the Greeks didn't wait behind their defensive wall. Instead, they advanced into the wider part of the pass, determined to kill as many enemies as possible before being overwhelmed. What followed was pure, desperate violence, the kind of close-quarters combat that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The remaining Greeks fought with fury born of desperation and resolve. Ancient sources describe scenes of almost unimaginable brutality as disciplined warfare devolved into savage melee. When their long spears shattered, the warriors fought with swords. When swords broke, they used daggers, rocks, even bare hands and teeth. Leonidas fell in the battle's heart. and a vicious fight erupted over his body as both sides struggled to claim the fallen king. The Greeks managed to recover their leader's corpse, but at enormous cost in casualties they could ill afford. Eventually, sheer weight of numbers became insurmountable. The survivors were pushed back to a small hill within the pass, where they made their final stand. Surrounded on all sides, with no hope of escape or rescue, they were finally overwhelmed by a storm of Persian arrows. By battle's end, virtually every Spartan and Thespian lay dead. The hot gates had finally fallen, and the path to southern Greece lay open to Xerxes' army. On the surface, Thermopylae was clearly a Persian victory. The Greek force had been annihilated, the pass was open, and Xerxes' army resumed its southward march. In a final act of rage, the Persian king ordered Leonidas' body decapitated and crucified, an act considered barbaric even by ancient warfare's brutal standards. But the cost of this victory was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest Persians lost somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 men, perhaps a quarter of their entire army, in just 3 days of fighting. More importantly, they had lost something irreplaceable, the aura of invincibility that had made Persian conquest seem inevitable. The 3-day delay also gave the rest of Greece precious time to prepare for the war's next phase. While Xerxes was battering himself against the Spartan shield wall, Greek naval forces were maneuvering into position for what would become the entire war's decisive battle. Just weeks after Thermopylae, Persian and Greek fleets met in narrow straits near the island of Salamis. Themistocles, the strategic genius behind the Thermopylae plan, had lured the larger Persian navy into confined waters where numerical superiority would be neutralized, exactly the same principle used at the Hot Gates. The result was a devastating Persian defeat. The Greek fleet, fighting in waters they knew intimately and motivated by heroism they'd witnessed at Thermopylae, completely shattered Persian naval power. Xerxes, watching from a throne on shore, saw his carefully assembled fleet destroyed in a single day. Without naval support, the massive Persian land army became a logistical nightmare. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, Xerxes was forced to retreat with most of his forces, leaving only a reduced army to continue the campaign. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, a unified Greek army, inspired by the memory of Leonidas and his men, crushed the remaining Persian forces, ending the invasion permanently and establishing Greek independence for generations to come. The true significance of Thermopylae extends far beyond military tactics or strategic outcomes. The battle became legend almost immediately, transforming from historical event into powerful symbol that would resonate through centuries. For the Greeks, Thermopylae represented something they had never possessed before, a shared identity and common cause transcending traditional rivalries between city-states. The sacrifice of the 300 became a rallying cry that helped forge Greek unity and ultimately led to their victory over the Persian Empire. The psychological impact was enormous. Here was proof that the supposedly invincible Persian war machine could be stopped, that ordinary men fighting for their freedom could stand against the greatest empire in the world. The morale boost rippled throughout the Greek world, stiffening resistance and convincing wavering cities to join the fight for independence. In the war's aftermath, Greeks erected monuments to commemorate their fallen heroes. A stone lion was carved to honor King Leonidas, and the poet Simonides composed what became one of history's most famous epitaphs. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie." But the story's influence didn't end with ancient Greece. For over 2 millennia, the tale of the 300 has been retold and reinterpreted by countless cultures and generations. It has inspired soldiers facing impossible odds, leaders confronting tyrannical powers, and ordinary people called upon to make extraordinary sacrifices. The battle has been immortalized in poetry, literature, art, and most recently in graphic novels and films that, while taking artistic liberties with historical facts, capture the essential spirit of the story. The idea that some principles are worth dying for, that courage can triumph over overwhelming force, and that a small group of determined people can indeed change the world. What makes Thermopylae truly immortal isn't just military drama or heroic sacrifice, but what it represents about human nature and the power of moral courage. The 300 didn't win their battle in any conventional sense, but they achieved something more important. They proved there are defeats so glorious they become more powerful than victories. The Spartans and their allies knew they were going to die, but they also understood their sacrifice would serve a greater purpose. They were buying time for their countrymen, demonstrating that Greek freedom was worth any price, and showing the world that tyranny, no matter how powerful, could not break the human spirit. In an age when individual liberty often seems fragile and democracy faces challenges from authoritarian powers, the story of Thermopylae remains remarkably relevant. It reminds us that freedom isn't free, that some things are worth fighting for regardless of odds, and that ordinary people, when called upon, are capable of extraordinary heroism. The Battle of Thermopylae ended with the annihilation of Leonidas and his brave warriors, but their story was just beginning. In dying at the Hot Gates, they achieved something more powerful than any military victory. They created a legend that has inspired humanity for over 2,000 years. Their sacrifice wasn't meaningless. It was the spark that ignited Greek resistance, the foundation stone of the victory that would preserve Greek civilization, and with it, the democratic ideals that would eventually spread throughout the Western world. In a very real sense, we're all inheritors of what those 300 men died for on that narrow strip of land between mountains and sea. The lesson of Thermopylae isn't that we should seek glorious deaths or hopeless causes. It's that when everything we value is at stake, when tyranny threatens freedom and darkness threatens light, ordinary people have the power to make extraordinary choices. Sometimes the smallest actions, made by the most unlikely heroes, can echo through eternity and change the course of human history. The story of Thermopylae is just one of countless epic moments that have shaped our world. If you want to explore more legendary battles, heroic last stands, and pivotal moments in human history, make sure to subscribe to our channel and smash that notification bell. Which historical battle or hero would you like to see us cover next? Let us know in the comments below. Your suggestions help guide our content, and we love hearing from fellow history enthusiasts. Remember to like this video if it gave you a new appreciation for one of history's most legendary battles, and share it with anyone who loves stories of courage against impossible odds. History isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the human drama that has shaped our world and continues to inspire us today. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to the Hot Gates. And until next time, remember that the echoes of ancient heroism still resonate in our modern world.